Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Kristina. I am your host for this lecture. We will now continue with a presentation from Madeleine Onstwedder, who is a life coach for social impact professionals. She's a certified life and somatic coach who specializes in self-care and managing burnout for purpose-driven people. She helps people manage overwhelm and stress by learning to show up for themselves as much as they do for the people and the causes they care about. This involves educating people about the effective and enjoyable self-care practices, work-life balance, time management, and healthy boundary setting. Madeleine is a huge believer that in order to show up for the things that matter to us most, whether that's social causes or loved ones, we have to show up for ourselves first. She completed the Courageous Living Coaching Certification and ICF accredited program in 2020. In her presentation, Madeleine will focus on the relationships between personal well-being and burnout, including the multiple factors that contribute to it, the challenges unique to social impact professionals, and the benefits that focusing on individual well-being can have. She will explain the process you can use to recognize your individual stressors and needs so that you can understand how to fit self-care into your life in a way that is manageable, sustainable, and effective. Before I hand over to you, Madeleine, then a reminder for all our attendees, please write your questions to Madeleine in the live questions tab, and we will read these out in the end of the talk. Madeleine will also be here available for a networking session after her talk, for which we will post a Zoom link in the chat. Okay, so now with great pleasure, I hand over to you, Madeleine. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I will just share my screen. Okay, and just to check that you can all see the slides now?
Yes, we see them well.
Okay, perfect. So hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm really excited to be talking about self-care for social change and preventing and managing burnout for animal rights activists. So first up, a little bit about me. I know we already had that wonderful introduction, but just to tell you a little bit about how I became interested in and got into this work. I started my career as an art educator, increasing access to the arts for people who have historically been excluded from those spaces. I always knew that I wanted to make the world a better place, which I'm sure many of you can also relate to. But I found that myself and my colleagues faced a number of issues that made it difficult and made the work unsustainable. There were long hours, bad pay, ridiculous job competition, very little job security, and an expectation to constantly go above and beyond, as well as having to navigate stakeholders who often weren't aligned with the mission of what we were doing. This led to consistently high levels of stress and even burnout, and a rise in mental health issues for myself and my colleagues. For many people, the work was unsustainable. People had to take time off or leave. And when I noticed all of these problems, I decided to pursue training as a life coach to help people like those who I work with and people like you who are really passionate about creating positive change in the world, learn how to make this work sustainable by focusing on personal well-being and self-care. So today's agenda, here is what you can expect us to cover today. We're going to be talking about what is burnout and why is it so widespread, especially in nonprofits. We'll be discussing the negative impacts of burnout on both a sector-wide, organizational, and personal level. We'll be talking about the relationship between burnout and well-being and the positive impacts of focusing on personal well-being. And then we'll be ending with some really practical and tangible steps so that you can figure out how to incorporate self-care effectively into your life to make sure that it is helping you to lower your stress levels and prevent burnout. And as we said, you can put questions in the chat. And I also encourage you to, if you have a pen and paper handy, to maybe write down how some of the things that I'm talking about today have been present in your own life and how these things show up for you. So let's start off by talking about what exactly is burnout. It can be characterized by these three main criteria. So the first one is an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. This can show up as just being tired all the time, finding it difficult to focus or concentrate on things, and even struggling with day-to-day tasks. The next key characteristic of burnout is feelings of cynicism and detachment. So this might show up as feeling like, oh, what's the point of the work that I'm doing? I'm not making any difference. Or maybe it shows up as a feeling of detachment because the work is so overwhelming that having that emotional distance from it is really the best way of coping with it. And then the third criteria of burnout is a sense of professional ineffectiveness and lack of accomplishment. And this means basically feeling as though you're not having the impact that you want to have, and maybe feeling kind of pessimistic about that, feeling as though you're not able to do your work as effectively, or maybe even that you can't do that work as effectively because of such high levels of stress. And I also want to share a little bit about the history of burnout. The word was first used by Herbert Freudenberger in 1970 to describe the really high stress levels experienced by doctors, nurses, and other people whose professions revolved around caring for others. And although now the term is used for any professional context, I think it's really interesting to notice that the word did originally arise in a situation talking about people whose primary role was to care for others. I think this gives us a hint as to why this is so widespread in the nonprofit sphere. What you're doing as activists is caring for the world around you, caring for the animals whose suffering you're trying to alleviate. And this is something that can just make it even harder to step away from the work. A 2016 article in the Association for Psychological Science, written by Alexandra Michel, explained that burnout is one of the greatest threats to workplace safety at the moment. She wrote that over time, jobs that require too much of employees will cultivate feelings of negativity and hopelessness. And nonprofits often do require a lot of their employees, whether that is expecting long hours, having a lot of work, too few people, and an expectation to always be on and engaging. The research that looks at well-being in the social impact space is still relatively new, but it's all pointing out the fact that there is a real problem here. And this was really cemented by a study published last year that was a culmination of several years of research into the well-being of social impact professionals. One of the things they found was, even as these change makers find solutions and make progress, many are burning out and experiencing a host of personal challenges, such as depression, divorce, and the early onset of chronic disease. Behind the scenes, many agents of change at all organizational levels and in regions all over the world are struggling. Changemakers such as yourselves are doing vital work, but facing huge challenges when it comes to caring for yourselves. And the emerging data about burnout in nonprofits is worrying. A 2010 study of 10,000 professionals at nonprofits found that 90% of people who left the sector cited burnout as the cause. And a 2018 study of UK charity workers found that 42% of those surveyed believe that their jobs were actively detrimental to their mental health. I hope these numbers show you that this is a huge problem that urgently needs to be addressed. So let's talk a little bit about what creates burnout. Why is this such a problem, especially in nonprofits? So as you can see from this diagram, there are structural factors, organizational factors, and individual factors that all work together and culminate in really high levels of burnout and stress. Some of the structural factors can include lack of job security, feeling beholden to many stakeholders, inequality within the movement, mental health stigma, and the fact that many social impact organizations are financially strained, which means that many change makers simply don't have access to the kinds of support that can help them, and are also often dealing with ongoing financial stress. Some of the organizational factors include poor time off policies, expectations to always be on and available, well-being being kind of a taboo topic to talk about, having too few people for the amount of work that needs to get done, the nature of the work sometimes being upsetting and very emotionally draining, and having a lot of time pressure and tight deadlines that need to be met. And then some individual factors include a lack of boundaries, putting work above everything else, having other personal life stressors that are going on and contributing to stress at work, and not having enough successful stress coping mechanisms. There's often a belief that making time for yourself, your own needs, means taking time away from the cause that you're passionate about. It's often seen as this kind of zero-sum game where the more energy you're giving yourself, the less you have to give to the work that you're doing. And this couldn't be further from the truth. We're going to dive into the positive ripple effects of personal well-being a bit later, but I did just want to plant that seed in your mind first. And now all three of these factors ideally need to be addressed in order to create long-lasting change in the nonprofit sphere. However, some of these organizational and structural factors can be outside of your control as an individual. And so I'm predominantly going to be talking about the individual factors of burnout and the individual methods that you can use to tackle this problem, simply because this is where you have the most agency to create direct, tangible change. And I just want to ask you to think a little bit about how do these three factors, these three levels of factors, show up in your own life? Where have you noticed these? How does this relate to your experiences? So now that we've seen that burnout is so widespread, I want to dive into why exactly is this such a problem? And just as the causes of burnout are not only on an individual level, the impacts of burnout aren't only faced by individuals either. Burnout has personal impacts such as deteriorating relationships, becoming unwell, whether that's mentally or physically, having a rise in mental health struggles, and needing to take time off or perhaps even leave your job altogether. This ripples out and creates organizational impacts. When valued employees have to leave, the organization has to spend more resources hiring and training, and perhaps other employees may become overworked in the meantime, leading to those individuals facing burnout too. And in terms of the cause and the sector as a whole, this means that time is being taken away from the most important work. It leaves the cause being unsustainable as a whole because the people who are knowledgeable and passionate about this work are having to take time away from it. So how has burnout impacted you and your organization? Okay, now let's dive into the relationship between burnout and personal well-being, and how personal well-being can have a positive impact not only on you, but on your organization and sector as well. So research conducted by the Wellbeing Project on wellness interventions for change makers and social impact professionals found that when people have support, such as an ongoing meditation practice or therapy, they experienced tremendously positive shifts in their lives. Doing this personal well-being work isn't going to get rid of those structural factors I spoke about, but it can still have a profound impact on people working in this space. So the Wellbeing Project conducted an 18-month study where they provided opportunities for change makers across a variety of fields and in a number of countries, opportunities to engage in personal well-being work, such as therapy, coaching, meditation, mindfulness, a number of things. And these are just some of the positive impacts that prioritizing personal well-being had. Participants learned to accept themselves as a whole person, rather than their work being their only identity. They learned greater self-awareness and learned how to separate themselves from their work identities and find meaning elsewhere in their lives. They learned how to be kinder to themselves by recognizing and reframing harsh criticism, which then fed into being kinder to others as well. They learned how to switch off from work and enjoy the rest of their life more. They found more time for hobbies, and their personal relationships improved too. They learned how to recognize and prioritize their own needs and separate this from what they thought other people expected of them. They learned to let go of the need to preserve a hero-like mentality, and they learned to stop seeing fear as a bad thing and instead saw it as simply part of the process, which helped them to be more creative. And they also became more resilient in the face of challenges. When stressful situations in their work arose, they had more tools that they could use to better equip themselves to deal with that and navigate those challenges more easily. And these positive benefits rippled outwards. When one person at an organization valued well-being more highly, the whole organization followed. This study found that on an organizational level, there were many benefits. The increases in empathy, compassion, and gratitude on a personal level led to an increase in trust throughout the entire organization. There was less fear of failure, and so people were more creative and more willing to take risks when they were thinking about potential problems and potential solutions to those problems. Relationships between colleagues deepened, and overall, the organization as a whole valued the well-being of their employees more highly. On a sector-wide level, people from different organizations became more open to collaboration. They learned from each other and actually enjoyed the process of working together to find more creative answers and solutions and better answers and solutions to the questions they were asking. They gained a greater appreciation of the opinions and thoughts of others. And the research is still underway in terms of the societal benefits of personal well-being, but I encourage you to be curious and to think about what impacts you think personal well-being might have on a societal level. And how could these benefits of personal well-being help you and your organizations? Okay, so now we're going to move on to how to incorporate self-care effectively. Now that we've seen that it is something that's really great, how do you actually do it? Now, knowing that you need to make time for self-care and personal well-being and actually doing it are two very different things. So I want to dive into some of the reasons why making time for self-care can be so difficult. Here are the 5 most common factors that can contribute to rising stress levels that can eventually lead to burnout, and that can make it harder to make time for self-care and activities that promote personal well-being. The 5 factors I'll be discussing are toxic productivity, lack of boundaries, martyr mentality, having misconceptions about self-care, and the emotional and potentially upsetting nature of the work itself. Understanding what affects you is key to figuring out a solution that is going to actually work for you. It's no use doing loads of self-care activities and suggestions that you see and hear from other people if they're not actually targeting the things that cause your stress. And now I'm going to ask our moderator to please put up this survey. And so as I'm talking and explaining what each of these 5 factors are, I want you to think about which one of these shows up the most in your life, and then you can answer the survey with that. So first up, what is toxic productivity? Toxic productivity is unhealthy desire to be productive at all times and at all costs. It includes defining your self-worth by how much you can accomplish, rather than seeing it as something inherent. It also includes not having any sense of identity outside of your work, feeling like your work defines who you are as a person and not having ways of finding meaning and value in your life outside of that. You might be feeling the effects of toxic productivity if you feel like a failure, if you're not constantly working. You feel pressure to be productive, even when you're officially off work on the weekends or evenings. You measure your success by how much you're able to do, and you don't feel like you deserve time off or a break unless you're being productive enough. And this contributes to rising stress levels because it makes it really, really hard to justify taking time away from the work, whether that's for a week or even just an evening. It can lead to overwork and exhaustion, which is one of the 3 key features of burnout that we discussed at the beginning. If you're trying to make time for self-care, but you believe that your worth is defined by how much work you do, it's going to be really, really hard to justify taking time away from that work to focus on yourself. So the next factor, the next thing we'll be discussing is having a lack of boundaries. So having clear boundaries is about knowing what you need and asking for it. It's about identifying what your basic needs are, what you need to do in order to support yourself and your emotional, mental, and physical health, and then making sure that you're setting aside enough time and energy for those things. So not having clear boundaries can show up as constantly putting other people's needs and convenience above your own. Maybe that shows up as saying yes to a meeting that's at a time when you actually want to be taking a lunch break, or saying yes to a meeting in the evening when you want to be relaxing with your loved ones. It could show up as saying yes to every opportunity out of a sense of obligation or fear of repercussions. So this might mean saying yes to a project that someone asks you to take on, even when you know that you're actually overworked enough as it is. Not having clear boundaries can also show up as not setting aside enough time to focus on your own well-being. It can lead to exhaustion because you're not making time for the things that you need to function at your best. And this is a key symptom of burnout. It can also just leave you with less time for your personal well-being efforts. And it can contribute to the belief that you don't deserve to take time away from work, or that taking time away from work and focusing on yourself is an inconvenience to others. The third thing I want to discuss is a martyr mentality. So what is this? It's basically the belief that your work is more important than your well-being. On an organizational level, this can look like a culture that promotes detrimental activities, whether that's overwork, a lack of sleep, bad hours, bad pay. And the study that I mentioned earlier about well-being in the social impact space found that for many people, working too much was still considered a badge of honor within the sector. On a personal level, this can show up as thinking that you don't deserve to relax or focus on self-care because there's still so much suffering out there. Now, this is definitely related to toxic productivity, but it can be specifically harmful for non-profit workers. You can also think of this as the phrase being a martyr to the cause. And it can look like believing you don't deserve to take a break when there's still work to be done, always putting other people first, even when it's detrimental to you, feeling ashamed for needing to take time off or not always being available. It's often really easy to get caught up in this because can oftentimes be the norm of the culture you're working in. It can be seen as a sign of commitment, either to your organization or to the cause as a whole. But making time for yourself and putting your own needs first doesn't mean that you're taking time away from the work that you're passionate about. Remember those ripple effects of the positive benefits of personal well-being that we looked at earlier, that benefited not only the individual, but the organization and the sector as a whole. Now we get to misconceptions about self-care. And some common misconceptions are self-care is selfish, it's taking my energy away from the cause I'm fighting for. It doesn't actually work. I mean, what use is a bubble bath going to do when I'm really overworked and stressed? Or that making time for self-care will just make me even more stressed out about how little time I have. And a lot of these misconceptions come from the way that self-care is talked about. I mean, how many of you have seen an article with 10 self-care ideas, and it's full of things like bubble baths and scented candles, and it doesn't have anything that is really tackling what's causing your stress in the first place. It's even sometimes used as a marketing gimmick for luxury skincare products, which probably aren't going to do a whole lot about fixing the things that are causing you stress. But self-care is actually just the act of caring for yourself. There's nothing selfish about that. It's 100% necessary, and it benefits both you and the people around you. And in terms of it being effective, well, there's no right way to do it. There's no one thing that is going to work for everyone, and you can tailor it to fit your exact needs. If bubble baths don't make a meaningful difference to your emotional well-being, you don't have to do that. We'll talk more about making self-care effective in your life a bit later on, but there are absolutely ways to tailor it to your unique circumstances. And one important point here is that the history of self-care is intimately tied to activism. The term was first used with its current meaning by the Black Panthers when they were fighting for healthcare access and building free clinics in the US. The relationship between self-care and social impact work isn't a one-way energy drain. The more you're able to prioritize your own needs, the more energy and passion you can bring to the important work that you're doing. And finally, we get to the work itself. Some of the challenges here that can contribute to burnout include being inundated with disturbing images and videos of animal cruelty, and feeling personally responsible for the success of your organization, its efforts, and the progress of the movement as a whole. It can even lead to feeling personally responsible for the animals whose suffering you're trying to remove. And this can obviously increase stress and make it harder to step away from work because it's constantly reminding you of the suffering that you're trying to stop. It can contribute to all three areas of burnout. It can lead to exhaustion because it's emotionally draining to see these images. It can lead to cynicism because if you are constantly seeing all the suffering that's out there, it can sometimes feel like, what's the point? And it can lead to detachment because sometimes that's a coping mechanism. It can lead to a sense of professional ineffectiveness. If it feels like the problem is so huge and daunting, it can be hard to see where you're making a difference because you're constantly seeing such horrible things. And this can make it harder to care for yourself as well. It can contribute to the martyr mentality or the belief that I can't take time for myself when so many animals are suffering. It can cause emotional distress and leave people with little energy and feeling like their work is ineffective because the problem is overwhelming. So each of these 5 stresses requires a slightly different approach. Preventing burnout starts with understanding what contributes to your stress and is making caring for yourself harder, and then coming up with a plan that tackles those specific things. And I also want to say it's very normal to have a combination of all 5 stresses. So now I want to go see the survey. See if I can see that. Oh. Okay, so it looks like toxic productivity, lack of boundaries is something that is really coming up as one of the most prominent stresses. That makes a lot of sense. And then also the work itself. Okay, great. I'm gonna go back to presenting. Okay, thank you so much everyone for filling that out. So now we're going to dive into what you can do to prevent burnout. So I use this framework of the 3 different types of self-care. So I'll briefly explain this, and then we'll talk about how this applies to your life and how you can use this framework. So first up is foundational self-care. And this is really your basic needs. Things like getting enough sleep, drinking enough water, eating food that nourishes you, moving your body in a way that feels good. It could also mean taking medications you need to, or doing physical therapy. It's all about making sure that you are meeting your basic needs that you need to do to function at your best. The next type is comforting self-care, which is probably the type that you're the most familiar with. It's things that provide an immediate sense of stress relief and relaxation because of the comfort they provide. This is where things like bubble baths and candles come in, but it can also include things like reading a book or playing a video game or a board game. And then the final type is stretch self-care. And stretch self-care is all about the things that take a little bit longer. It's more of a long-term benefit rather than that very short-term, immediate stress relief of comforting self-care. So some things that stretch self-care can include are making time for hobbies that give you a sense of identity outside of your work. It could also include things like going to therapy or seeking professional help and support. It can also include stuff that maybe isn't so fun, like taking care of your finances, but that has a really positive impact in the long run. So stretch self-care is about those things that have a more long-term effect on your well-being. And it's really important to make time for each of these 3 types of self-care. If you're not making time for foundational self-care, this means that you're taking care of your basic needs, leading to feeling run down and maybe even becoming ill. If you're not making time for comforting self-care, then you're not providing yourself any immediate stress relief. And so that stress is going to keep building and building and building until it becomes overwhelming and unmanageable. And if you're not making time for stretch self-care, it's likely you're not making time for those activities that help you feel really fulfilled. You might find yourself in cycles of stress, feeling really stressed and then doing something to bring that stress down, but the stress keeps coming up over time. So it can lead to feeling unfulfilled or putting off important things like finding a therapist or a coach or doing activities that give your life meaning outside of work. This also relates to the 3 burnout characteristics. Oops, pressed too early. So exhaustion, one of the 3 symptoms of burnout, can be caused by not enough foundational self-care, not doing the things to meet your basic needs. Cynicism and detachment can be caused by not having enough comforting self-care, detaching from the work as a coping mechanism for the amount of stress, or maybe not having enough stretch self-care, not doing the things that really fill you up the most. And a sense of ineffectiveness can really be caused by a lack of all 3, not having enough of an identity outside of work, or not having enough energy to show up for your work fully. So having 3 different types of self-care that it's really important to make time for can feel like a lot to do, especially if you already have a very busy schedule. So I'm going to run through some ideas of different types of self-care in this table, some ideas that take less than 5 minutes, and then some things that are a bit longer, so that you can get a sense of how each of these 3 types of self-care doesn't have to take very much time at all. So very quick foundational self-care activities could include doing some quick neck and shoulder stretching to make sure that your back is feeling okay, even if you're sitting at a desk all day. It could look like giving your eyes a break from looking at screens all the time, or even standing up and walking around your apartment or your office. Some activities that take a bit longer include going on a run or taking a long walk, or taking an hour to fully wind down before bed to make sure that you get a good night's sleep. Some really quick, comforting self-care activities could include lighting a scented candle, making a cup of tea, listening to your favorite song, or having a 5-minute dance party in the middle of your day. Some longer activities could be taking a bath, watching an episode of your favorite TV show or movie, or reading a book or playing a board game. Anything that is just providing you with a sense of fun or relaxation. Some stretch self-care activities that don't take very long could be taking some really deep breaths to ground yourself in the present moment, doing a quick body scan, noticing what you're feeling in any moment, repeating an affirmation or thinking of something to be grateful for, or writing down something that you accomplished that day. And some things that take a bit longer include maybe processing your feelings in a journal, going to therapy or coaching and seeking professional support, spending time on a hobby, whether that's music or art or anything that brings you joy, or even something like meditating. So now I want you all to think back to the stresses that you identified earlier, and I'll make sure to focus the most on the ones that most people said were coming up to them, but I will be talking about all of them. So once you've identified which stressor is the most prevalent for you, you can really tailor your self-care and your personal well-being efforts to make sure that you're really tackling that specific problem. So if toxic productivity is something that you really struggle with, you can do that with foundational self-care by stretching your neck and shoulders throughout the day, making sure that you're caring for your body and putting those basic needs first instead of getting sucked into work for the entire day. You can remind yourself that you're not your work. And if you have a bit more time, you can unpack how toxic productivity affects you with a coach or a therapist or a friend. You can also make sure to build an identity outside of work, spending time on hobbies and things like that. If you really struggle with having boundaries and having a lack of boundaries, then some things that you can do would be to switch off your notifications after a certain time to make sure that your sleep isn't being interrupted. Or you could remove email from your phone or any other apps that tend to stress you out. You can really prioritize your sleep, and you can check in with yourself regularly. And by checking in with yourself, I mean asking yourself, what are my basic needs right now? Are these basic needs being met? So for an example, this could look like someone hands you a project that they're asking you to do. You can check in with yourself, acknowledge, actually, I'm pretty overwhelmed with the amount of work that I have already. Remind yourself, and then make sure that you're not taking on new projects when you already have way too much to do. Sharing boundaries isn't a one and done type of thing, and it can definitely be really challenging. That could be an entire presentation in itself, but it is so, so worth it. And if a martyr mentality is something that you struggle with, it can be really powerful to get clear on what your basic needs are, and then make sure that you are putting those front and center. It can also be helpful to remind yourself that you getting burnt out isn't going to help your cause. Think back to those ripple effects, the ripple effects of burnout, of how burnout can actually hurt your organization, and the ripple effects, the positive impacts of personal well-being. Maybe make a list of how focusing on yourself actually benefits those around you, and put that someplace where you'll see it every day. And if misconceptions about self-care are something that you struggle with, you can start doing some things that don't take very much time, and then just notice that they're making an impact for your personal well-being. You could remind yourself that self-care isn't selfish. Figure out what misconception you have and then put it on a post-it note, something that kind of tackles that belief, and stick it up somewhere where you'll see it. If you have some more time, you could journal about the long-term benefits of self-care, both for you and for your organization as a whole. And if you find that the work itself is what really contributes to your stress, try adding in some comfort to your day-to-day. This could be something as simple as you're making a cup of tea or your daily cup of coffee, making that be a bit of a mindful moment where you allow your brain to switch off from the work that you're doing. Or you can have a bit of a longer time to unwind by watching your favorite movie or reading a book or playing a game, anything that is just giving your brain a break from the difficult work that you have to deal with each day. And if you have time for some stretch self-care, setting boundaries around how much of this upsetting content you consume and when you consume it can be really powerful. I also want to point out that managing stress and preventing burnout can be done most effectively with a two-pronged approach, which is an approach laid out by Emily and Amelia Nagoski in their book, Burnout. So there's dealing with the stressor, which is the thing that is causing you stress, and then dealing with the stress itself. And both of these things are important. So for example, dealing with the stressor could be if you're feeling really overworked, setting boundaries and not taking on too much work prevents the stressor of having too much work from existing. Stress is the physiological and emotional response that you have to the stressor. So something you can do to alleviate this could be going for a run or processing your feelings through journaling, and that will help you work through the stress response. Ideally, you'll be able to deal with both of these, but sometimes the stressor will be outside of your control. Dealing with the stress can still help, however, and it will dramatically impact your experience of the stressor. So it can be helpful to ask yourself, what is causing the stress? And how can you deal with that? And how can you process the stress itself? Now, we are almost at the end, and then we'll have some time for questions, but I do want to leave you with some actionable steps to actually bring these activities into your life, because it is all very well to say doing these things are really great, but if you feel like you don't have time for them, it's going to be really hard to implement that in your everyday life. So my first tip is to add an aspect of self-care to something you already do. For example, this could be practicing gratitude while you brush your teeth, or being really mindful when you take a shower and grounding yourself and being in the present moment. It could be something as simple as walking around your apartment while you wait for the kettle to boil or for your coffee to finish brewing. This helps to make sure that you're practicing self-care consistently and integrating it seamlessly into your life. So next up is to put self-care on your calendar. Set aside a day or a half day on your calendar for some of those longer self-care activities. Maybe you want to book a class for a new hobby, or have some time journaling, or just get out of the house and go on a hike. This means because it's on your calendar, you can do anything you need to do in advance, such as organizing childcare, to make sure that you actually have that time free. The third thing you can do is start a daily reflection habit. Now, I think journaling is great, but sitting down for an hour-long journaling session might feel overwhelming, and it might not fit into your schedule very well. So something that you can do instead is at the end of your workday, write down one challenge and one win from the day. This makes sure that you're taking the time to acknowledge what you accomplish each day, which can really help to prevent that sense of professional ineffectiveness that is a key part of burnout. And it creates a clear end point to the day. It signals to your brain that work time is over and you're transitioning into personal time. You could also do a full self-care review. So set aside maybe an hour or so to reflect on the self-care activities you've been doing and making sure that what you're doing is effective, or if it isn't, coming up with a plan to adjust things. What's been working for you and what hasn't? What are some things you want to try? Number 5 is to create some daily affirmations that really resonate with you, and you can put them on a Post-it note somewhere and see them each day. My recommendation is to start small, because affirmations are only helpful if they actually feel true to you. For example, if you often experience a fear of failure in your work, telling yourself, "I'm fearless," might feel a bit inauthentic or just a bit too much. Instead, you could try an affirmation like, "I'm learning to work through my fear." And then you can take the steps you need to do to actually work through that. But if affirmations aren't your thing, that's totally fine. And you can maybe write down some quotes about self-care instead, or you can write down a reminder of the positive benefits that focusing on personal well-being can bring. And my final tip is to bring a social element into your self-care. We often think that because self-care is something we do for ourselves, it's also something we have to do by ourselves. But actually, as we've, I'm sure, all learned over the past year and a half, social interaction has huge benefits for our emotional well-being, especially in times of stress. So one way to do this is to find someone in your life who also wants to make more time for self-care and do some activities together. This could be a friend, a loved one, even a colleague. You could go to a webinar together or do a guided meditation and unpack and reflect on your experience together afterwards. This also has the benefit of having someone to talk to when you're struggling to make time for your self-care. Chances are someone else will be able to be a lot more compassionate and understanding to you than you are to yourself. So it can be really, really helpful if you've been struggling to make time for your self-care practices. I really hope that this has been helpful and that you take on board some of these tips. And I would love to hear what self-care activities you're thinking of trying and how you can incorporate those into your life. And I want to reiterate that prioritizing your own well-being can dramatically improve not only your own life, but the lives of the people around you and your organization as a whole. If you're interested in continuing this work and diving more into bringing self-care into your day, you can sign up for my newsletter to get access to a workbook that will teach you how to create a personal self-care kit. And I've also set aside some time just for people who are attending this conference to have a free 30-minute chat with me to talk through any of the struggles you're having to do with burnout, work-life balance, self-care, or time management. And you can follow the link that I have below to sign up for those. So thank you so much. And I look forward to answering any questions that you have.
Thank you very much for this really great talk, Madeleine. And yeah, a topic so important to all of us. And thank you for telling us about this. We now have some time for questions, and there are a lot of questions from the audience already. So Maddie would like to know, are the self-care tips you mentioned best for prevention, or do you think they can also help when you've already reached the burnout stage?
That's a really good question. And I think that they can be helpful for both. I think with self-care, obviously it's great if you can take a preventative approach, but if you already are in that period of burnout, I would say that all of these tips are still helpful because that's when your self-care is especially important. I think that when you're really burnt out, I would recommend that you start with that foundational self-care. So really getting clear on what your basic needs are, and then making sure that all of those things are being met. Because oftentimes when you're burnt out and you're feeling really exhausted and run down, you need some time to oftentimes just really rest in a meaningful way. And then as you begin to feel more rested, you'll have a bit more energy for some of those other types of self-care. So for the comforting and the stretch self-care. So I hope that that helps. And yes, you can definitely use all of the tips that I've brought in. And I would say that when you're really burnt out, reflecting on how your self-care is working for you can be especially impactful because you have such limited energy when you're burnt out anyway. You don't want to be spending it on stuff that isn't effective for you.
Thank you very much. Next question comes from Anna. She would like to know, what signs of burnout can we be sensitive to when observing team members as we work remotely? I think working remotely, they can be harder to notice.
Oh, that is such a good question. And also, I love how you're thinking about looking out for your team members. That's really wonderful. So I think that something you can look out for is keep those 3 characteristics front of mind. If someone is sharing that they're feeling kind of tired, or when you get on a Zoom call or a meeting with them and they're seeming consistently run down all the time, that might be an indication that they're nearing that point of burnout. At the same time, if someone is maybe a bit more detached from their work than usual, if they're maybe struggling to get things in on time, if they're struggling with their time management, or alternatively, if they're working all the time and it seems like they're always replying to emails and never taking any breaks, that can also be a clear sign that they might be struggling. And then thirdly, someone on your team might be an indication that you could look out for is maybe notice if they're kind of questioning the effectiveness of what they're doing, wondering if things are really working. Something else that can come along with burnout is finding it really difficult to be creative. So if someone on your team is really struggling to participate in conversations around the direction of your organization and things like that, that can also be a sign that they're struggling. And I really recommend also doing what you can to create an environment that allows people to be open about the struggles that they're having. Again, that study that I mentioned that was researching this did find that even when just one person at an organization, especially when it was someone in a leadership position, started being more open, talking about their own mental health, their own experiences of stress and burnout, other people then felt more comfortable bringing those things to the table too. And so if it is something that feels comfortable for you, you can try by sharing a bit about your own experiences, and then that might inspire other people on your team to be more open with you as well about the difficulties they're experiencing.
Thank you for these tips. One more question from Marta. Are highly sensitive people more prone to burnout?
Oh, good question. I think in general, I would say yes. I think if you are highly sensitive, then it is likely that each of those 5 stresses that I spoke about is going to affect you a bit more, just because you might be a bit more susceptible to that. So I think for you, if you are a highly sensitive person, boundaries are really, really key. So especially things like if you find that your work, you're often coming into contact with lots of upsetting images and videos, setting boundaries around when you consume those things, when you want time away from those things can be really key, because it's likely that those will have a really high impact on your own well-being. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's any other advice I would give to you. Something else I think that can be really helpful if you are a highly sensitive person is to share your experiences with people who are close to you. If you have a trusted friend or a partner or a coach or a therapist, talking these things through with them can really help to alleviate that. And if you don't have any of those people, then even just journaling about those experiences to process those experiences can be helpful, so that you're not holding on to them. Because especially if you're highly sensitive and you're holding on to those experiences and not processing them, the impact and how those experiences are affecting you is going to grow and grow and grow. So yes, I do think that if you're highly sensitive, you might be more susceptible to burnout, but there are definitely still things that you can do to alleviate that.
Thank you again for this great tips and advice. We have quite a lot more questions. I will just go through them to see which ones.
Yeah, thank you so much for everyone who's asking questions. These are all really, really great.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to all the attendees. So one question from Marta. What would you say would be the first, most important step to get out of the burnout?
I would say the most important step is to rest. And I know that that sounds really simple, but that doesn't mean that it's easy. And also, there will be different things that might make it easier or harder for you to do that. If you are able to take time off, however short that is, whether that's a day, maybe taking a long weekend, but to really just rest, to give your mind a break, to create as much distance between yourself and your work as possible. I would say that that is a good place to start, because dealing with kind of trying to help your burnout in terms of like having an identity outside of work, you can't do those things if you're just fundamentally exhausted. So yeah, I think the number one most important thing you can do is to rest.
Thank you. We have many more questions, but we are out of time for right now to answer more. So we will continue with a networking session. We will post a link for everyone in the chat, and everyone whose questions were not yet answered can just join us in the networking Zoom session and can use the chance to ask your questions to Madeleine there.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for coming to this presentation and for asking such amazing questions. I'm sure that everyone else who got to listen to your questions also really resonated with them. So thank you so much.